Is this the entrance to a vampire's lair? Yes, it is. Is it also a miniature Masters of the Universe inspired build? Kinda. Is it a Warhammer Night Lord's piece of terrain? Sure. Is it a DM screen for D&D? Absolutely. So does that mean you can use it as a dice rolling tray? Sure does, bud. Honestly, none of those things except for the vampire's castle entrance were planned when I started this build. But when you're building, you just gotta run with stuff. And if the project starts taking you in different directions, lean into it. Like most great projects, this one started with a plastic skull Halloween decoration. $4, very well spent. I quickly decided to get rid of the jaw and save it for something else in the future. I had the idea of this skull sitting on top of a wall above the entrance to a castle. And while an entranceway through an open mouth of a skull would be really cool, it wasn't exactly in line with what I was imagining for a vampire's castle. Using some big chunks of thick XPS foam, I marked out what I needed to remove from the skull to make it sit nicely on that right angle. These big blocks of foam are great to build with, but impossible to find in local hardware stores. If you want to get some, there's a link in the description to a foam supplier that I partnered with to make them available to hobbyists. The key to a great looking castle entrance is a big imposing gate or door. I found these MDF window kits that are made by Shifting Lands that had the perfect top arch to them. They were too short, so I used two of them together to create one taller one. Because these kits were meant to assemble into a frame, they left me with some odd gaps on the lattice. To hide this, I cut some thin strips of chipboard to cover these gaps. This would also give the door a more layered and three-dimensional look. I cut out a little window area from one side. I always like those little windows on doors of big fortified structures in like movies. It's a great tool for interactions, especially in RPGs. It couldn't just be open though, so I found another MDF window piece with an interesting pattern and glued it to the backside. I had to cut out the shape of this gate into the very thick piece of foam, which would not be easy. After centering and tracing the shape, I made the cutout on my hot wire table freehand. Always a risky move, but since this would eventually become a rocky wall, I knew I had some level of forgiveness when it came to making a perfect cut. A basic rectangle with a skull on it is pretty boring. I needed some turrets on the ends, and I had this cardboard mailing tube that was perfect. I just needed to cut it to length first. You could handsaw this, but seriously, ain't nobody got time for that. I didn't want them just stuck to the flat ends of foam. They needed to be embedded a little bit to be properly integrated. This was another challenge in freehand hot wire cutting. And this wonderful stone texture does not just happen with a quick pass of a texture roller or a tinfoil ball. Each jagged stone needs to be individually carved and applied. This is a great opportunity to use up some scrap foam. There isn't exactly a perfect science to this. It's really just a matter of breaking and cutting up jagged pieces with flat backs. My eyes and my back were ready for a break at this point, so now is a great time to talk about this video's sponsor, Archvillain Games. Every month, as a member of the Archvillain Games Patreon, you will get a collection of awesome themed miniatures to 3D print at home. These models are ideal for tabletop role-playing games like D&D, but also very handy as interesting proxies for games like Warhammer. The theme this October is vampires, and you definitely can't go wrong with vampires. They're so iconic. Strahd is one of the greatest D&D villains of all time, and Ravenloft is easily one of the best settings. My first ever death as a D&D player was delivered by a vampire. Every set comes with a range of model sizes from typical characters on 25mm bases all the way up to massive display piece behemoths. There's even a killer prop included in every set. These models are pre-supported and you can get them all for only $10 a month, which is fantastic. They also have a $13.99 tier that includes fun stuff for using the models in games like original adventures, stat blocks, and maps designed for 5th edition. Really, you can't go wrong with this deal, and I guarantee that each month you'll get a cool set of thematic models to terrorize your players. There's a link in the video description where you can find out more and sign up for yourself. You'll notice I left some of the cardboard tubes exposed, and I could get away with that because I plan on covering those areas and any large gaps with pre-mixed acrylic grout. This would give the smooth cardboard a wonderful rocky texture and help blend the big pieces of foam together. Since this was a vampire's castle, the skull needed some fangs. To make them, I just used some green stuff, which would be very simple to sculpt, but I know green stuff can snap easily once cured in shapes like this, so I cut a bit of copper wire to put inside of my fangs to make them stronger. I was loving how this thing was looking. It brought me all the nostalgic vibes and feels of the He-Man toys I loved as a kid. This particular foam rock carving style totally has that 80s toy castle vibe. I wanted to roll with that, so I grabbed some bits to make it even more 80s toy silly. I had a Reaper Bones dragon model that I'd likely never use on its own, and it's like its wings were made to fit around this particular skull. This helped to keep that Masters of the Universe vibe going even harder. All of a sudden, I was making a castle for Hordak. I always thought the playset that he got back in the day was pretty weak and forgettable compared to Castle Grayskull or Snake Mountain, so this was my chance to make the kind of lair he deserved. I wanted to fill in some of the smaller gaps in the foam and give a subtle texture to the other areas of the build that the grout would just be too gritty for. I used some basic modeling paste, watered down, to cover the foam and fill some gaps. This also allowed me to give the smooth plastic skull a little bit of tooth to help the paint stick and make it blend better with its surroundings. This one got black base coated by hand because there was just too many little nooks and crannies to spray paint or airbrush. For paint though, I did break out the airbrush and the inks. This was an ideal candidate for a highlight paint job followed by vibrant inks. I had the idea of this 80s toy castle in my head, and I was committed to going with that look at this point. Because I had Hordak in mind, I decided on a blue and red color scheme, which also would work very well for something like Castle Strahd in D&D. What I didn't consider, however, was that the blue with a red highlight would just end up making everything kind of purple. I mean, this was fine. It still looked awesome. It just looked more Snake Mountain than I was intending. After a quick dry brushing with a light gray, I went back with the red ink onto the skull and the wings to give it a more dramatic color separation from the now purple stones. The gate was just primed black and dry brushed in gunmetal. This thing looks so cool. I dare say it looked radical, but it could be helped with a little more shadow and highlighting to make it pop. I made a black oil wash with a hint of red mixed in and used this to line all of the crevices. This small bit of deep shadow makes every element and texture stand out. Following this with some vibrant red highlights created a dynamic and exaggerated fantasy art style look that I am so into. This thing is cool. It looks like so many things that I love. It could come from the He-Man universe, it could come from Ravenloft, it definitely looks like it could be on the cover of an old school RPG module, or an 80s heavy metal album. It's perfect. It's a big honkin' piece of terrain, it works as a DM screen and as a dice tray, and it's gonna make an awesome display piece alongside my vintage D&D collection. Seriously, what's not to love about this build? I have no regrets about this project. It is just so damned cool. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know in the comments section. Leave a like on the video, share it with some friends. That all helps the channel immensely. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe, check out my essential equipment page, and of course, my Patreon. Those are the two best ways to support this channel and help me keep making videos. That's it. That's all. See you again next week.